everybody. I would first just like to give a shout out to our band, the Young Picassos. And I would also, after the conclusion of Dr. Hill's speech, we'll have Dr. Edward Ramsamy, the chair of the Africana Studies Department, come up and moderate the question and answer session. So if we can also give him a round of applause. So, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is one of the leading intellectual voices in the country. In fact, in 2011, Ebony magazine named him one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. He has held numerous academic positions, including Distinguished Professor of African American Studies at Morehouse College, as well as Columbia University and Temple University, focusing on the topics of intersection between culture, politics, and education. Since his days as a youth in Philadelphia, Dr. Hill has been a social justice activist and organizer. He is a founding board member of My Fifth, a nonprofit organization devoted to educating youth about their legal rights and responsibilities. He is also a board member and organizer of the Philadelphia Student Union. Dr. Hill also works closely with the ACLU Drug Reform Project, focusing on drug enforcement policy. Over the past few years, he has actively worked on a campaign to end the death penalty and to release numerous political prisoners. Dr. Hill is also the author or co-author of several award-winning books. Like that of our office, he often speaks about providing access to those in need, most prominently in the Black community. One of my favorite quotes of his is that we live in a world where Black humanity is a relatively new idea. I'm glad that he's here today to dismantle these various topics. So without further ado, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Well done. I was walking out like, I wonder what they're gonna play for me. She got Isn't She Lovely? I get P-I-M-P. Wow. I don't know what to do now. Got my now later Gators on. Let me see. Good afternoon. What a great crowd for a Thursday afternoon in New Brunswick. I didn't know what I was going to expect or what I was going to see. And when they said they opening partitions and people are here, I was incredibly grateful. Not just for the invitation, but for the institutional commitment to diversity and inclusion. I'm sure we have a long way to go. All institutions do, but having a week committed to thinking through questions and issues of diversity is incredibly important. Recognizing the significance of it, not reducing it to a day or a moment or a workshop, is incredibly significant. So I do want to say thank you all for that. And the question of diversity and inclusion is one that we must always raise, we must always wrestle with. I think for many of us, though, the need to wrestle with it, the need to struggle with it maybe became more clear, and our efforts to redress the problems that we're facing became more intensified on November 8th, 2016. Y'all heard about this, right? Just making sure. And it's not a partisan argument I'm making, although I could. I think more significantly, it's a question of what values do we hold? Where do we want to be as a nation? And how does higher education play into that? The question of diversity for me at universities is important because the university itself is such an important site of possibility. Universities, at least as they're idealized, are the spaces where we nurture ideas, where we develop dangerous ideas, where we organize, where rigorous research is being done, where active teaching happens, where students develop their identities or nurture their identities even further. They enter new stages of humanity. Professors develop and grow intellectually and more richly, and they challenge the status quo. University leaders are entrusted with stewarding this whole project. And so much of the American university is tied to our vision of American democracy and American possibility. In many ways, the American democratic experiment itself is rooted in a belief that if everybody has access to quality education, if everybody has access to higher education in particular, at various moments in American history that's meant different things, but if everybody has access to these things, that at some point you can be anything you want. You can grow, you can expand, you can get access to American prosperity. You can not just develop the whole self, but you can actually have access to the spoils of democratic citizenship. You can have access to housing and health care. You can have access to the highest ideals. You can get all that good stuff if this thing is working right. The question is this thing working right? And I go around the country, I go around the world, in fact, at universities everywhere, and I have yet to find a place that says this thing is working right. And the thing that continues to nudge at us and nag us is the question of diversity. So I want to talk tonight about, or this afternoon rather, how we can think about diversity and how we can get the kind of environments in higher education that we want. The first thing we have to do, though, I think, when we talk about diversity is begin from a fundamental premise. Everything I say tonight begins from a fundamental premise. That premise is that diversity is an institutional asset. Now, that might seem like a common sense, taken for granted assumption, but for so many people, the idea that diversity is an institutional asset is anything but a taken for granted truth. We tend to think of diversity as a benefit to the people being included. We think of diversity as a hookup for black folk. We get some people from Newark. You can always tell people from Newark. They let you know quick. But that's the idea, right? We get some black folk from Newark. We get some Latinos in here. We grab some South Asians. Look at what we're doing for the people. We've made Raheem's life better. But what we fail to recognize, either in our empirical analysis of the data or in our cultural practices and rituals, is the fact that the diversified institution, the diversified university, is a benefit to the university itself. White people, y'all benefit too when you got blacks and Latinos in the room. We benefit from having women in the room. We benefit from having trans folk in the room. We benefit from having queer folk in the room. The institution is better. The data suggests that that homogenous groups reach conclusions more quickly. That if people are all of the same sort, we may arrive at a conclusion more quickly. And it kind of makes sense. You hang out with your friends, y'all do whatever y'all do, right? You don't eat at the same place we always eat. But heterogeneous groups, even if they take a little bit longer, they arrive at more dynamic and creative conclusions. They come up with more innovative solutions. They arrive at things that they otherwise would not if they didn't have people from different traditions and different worldviews and different experiences trying something. It's like when you hang with new people, you might do some new stuff. You might go on a date with somebody you ain't never met before. You try it. I'll try Thai. Why not? You're open to new possibilities. And those new possibilities are the very thing that anchor American or any university. The ability to dislodge ourselves from taking for granted truths, from articles of faith that should themselves be unhinged. Everything should be called into question, but it's hard to do that if everybody is the same. So we have to recognize that the university is better when it's diverse. When we do that, we stop being so proud of ourselves and patting ourselves on the back every time we add a black or a brown face, and instead we say, how can we diversify more so that we can be better? And then the question becomes next, well, what is diversity? Which means we have to thicken our analysis and understanding of diversity. So first we got to value diversity as a thing, and the next we have to say, what is diversity? Because without question, the race question is the most enduring and intractable question in American life. As the critical race theorists talk about, racism may be the most difficult thing to unhinge. It is America's original sin. not just racism, let's talk broader, white supremacy. Eddie Glaude talks about the value gap, the idea that white people's lives are just worth more. This normalized assumption pervades everything, and so part of what we're always trying to do within these institutions and other institutions is evict white supremacy from our own consciousness. It's trying to denormalize the belief that white lives are worth more and that white values are the center of the universe. We have to do that work, and so we have to think about race in that way, but we also, in addition to thinking about the racial diversity, and we must think about racial diversity in the American university, we must also wrestle with other forms of diversity, racial diversity, that aren't locked purely within the black-white paradigm. Because sometimes when we get within the American context, we purely think about the black-white paradigm, and in doing so, we can lose sight of the fact that diversity looks a lot of different ways, even within the context of race. For example, we need to have not just black folk and white folk, we need an Asian student population. But we also can't fall into narrow, essentialist notions of what it means to be Asian. Because sometimes we'll talk about black folk and white folk, and then we'll say, and we need some Asians in the building, and we lose sight of the fact that Asia is a very big continent, and that cultures within the Asian context are varied. So if I say I have a 30% student population that's Asian, and we say, oh, that's great, we have a great diversified Asian population, but they all come from one place, and they're all South Asian, for example, but we don't have any Cambodians, or we don't have any Hmong in the room, or we don't have any Koreans in the room, then we have a particular slice of a population that isn't also as diverse as it could be. And what we also must do when we bring in those people outside the context of the black-white paradigm, which brings in its own set of histories and biases and stereotypes and prejudices and experiences, we have to understand people within their own cultural context. So as I bring in Asian students, for example, in addition to not essentializing them by deciding where they're from, we must also not essentialize their needs or their experiences. So for example, I work with students who often talk about this. I had a student, she's Cambodian, and she was like, first day, this is a high school student, but a college student told me a very similar story in Milwaukee, who was Hmong. And she said, you know, I come to intro to algebra, I go to advanced calc. They put me in advanced calc even though I'd never taken a math course before. Counselor told me I'd figure it out. First day of algebra, the 12th grade, the high school student, said, the teacher said, you know, you're going to be my teaching, you're going to be like my teaching assistant. You'll tutor the other students. Now, this was problematic for several reasons. One, maybe she didn't want to do that. Who wants to do that? TAs don't want to TA. Second, she was like, I'm not even good at math. But the assumption that the stereotype, as long as it's quote unquote positive, would be one that wouldn't cause any harm or damage is somewhat short-sighted because one, it loses sight of the fact that maybe she's not good at math, right? We can't assume that because you're of any particular descent, you're good at a particular thing. Second, if she fails at math, or just average at math, she's gonna get a different look from the teacher, like, oh, wait, you know, you should be doing much better. They're clearly not putting any effort in. Or even if you do well, it won't be attributed to your talents. Like, well, of course you did well. So these are what the students are expressing to me, this sense that no matter how they do, fare well or poorly, that they are being sort of narrowly bound by an expectation of the institution of who and what they are, because the institution can't tell the difference. So part of what we have to do is learn to tell the difference as we operate within these diverse paradigms, but diversity also can't just be within the racial context. We must also think about what it means to have gender diversity. Not just on the campus, because it doesn't matter if 60% of the campus are women, if they all are located in fields that the institution and that male patriarchy or that patriarchy has historically deemed appropriate. So if the women are in English, but they're not in STEM fields, if the professoriate is filled with professors of maybe sociology and psychology, but we can't find anybody in engineering, then that also represents a structural and institutional problem. We need diversity not just within the institution, but within various fields. We must also think about sexuality and gender identity. Now, because historically and legally we haven't always designated these folk as protected classes within particular conversations, we haven't prioritized it. Too often, the university's impulse is to do what will allow them to check off boxes, to make sure that they get federal funding, to make sure that they can say in the public sphere that they are doing the right thing by diversity. But there are other forms of diversity that may not check a box, but still satisfy our need to have a more inclusive environment. That means that we have to have queer students, not just on campus, because there's always been queer students. As I tell people at Morehouse, we're getting an influx of gay students. No, y'all, we always had gay people at Morehouse. It's a 1,200-person all-male school in Atlanta. I promise you, we have always had gay people. But you have finally come to terms with what that means. And what we have to do openly and honestly is come to terms with the fact that we have gay student populations and be open and inviting to those different traditions, to those different identities, to those different performances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Without doing so, we ourselves are problematic. That means we have to actually be open to saying, hey, we have trans students or people who may be silently trans, because we have spaces, particularly like the military, particularly the Marines, where people are often trans but don't come out or identify as trans because the institutions themselves are hostile. We need to be open to that. That means you got to have a trans bathroom in every building. You have to have a gender-neutral bathroom in every building. That's not a difficult thing to do. People say, oh my God, we have to get used to that. No, you don't. You got a gender-neutral bathroom in your house. You go to your grandmama's house. It ain't marked male and female. You go to grandma's house for Thanksgiving, where the male bathroom at? No, you go in that bathroom. You knock first, and then you go in and you use the bathroom, then you leave. And everything works out just fine. We also have to think about economic diversity. Not just in terms of SES or socioeconomic status, but also in the context of experience. For example, people might argue right now, Trump notwithstanding, that we have the most diverse Supreme Court we've ever seen. And that may in fact be true. We have a wise Latina on there, Sonia Sotomayor. We got black folk on there. We're not gonna do that, no. Y'all petty. I'm not doing that. We have women on the court. We have a diverse court. So you could step back and say, look at all this diversity. If we had another black person, or say Trump appoints a black woman. I mean, it's possible it'd be Omarosa, but it's possible, right? Like, but what, would that be his worst appointment? At least she could spell Betsy DeVos, Jesus. Anyway, she spelled it wrong, then she apologized and spelled apologize wrong. Now, I don't trip about spelling. I think that could become a way of being classist or ableist. People misspell and mistype things all the time. But there is an irony in the kind of unfettered white mediocrity that pervades his administration. But no extra charge for that. Let me get back to the point. There's this way, but the court is diverse. But then you look at their backgrounds and everybody went to Harvard Law School, Yale Law School. That's a particular set of experiences. So even if you are the wise Latina, even if you are a black man from the South, if you go through those institutions, there's a particular way that those institutions discipline both the body and the mind. There's a particular way that they understand juridical reasoning. There's a particular way that they engage the law. There's a particular theoretical apparatus that they deploy. What would it mean to not just have folks from Harvard and Yale, but have some of the genius alum from Rutgers Law School? That would do something different. We have to ask different questions and diversify our diversity. And then we get to the campus. And we got to ask fundamental questions, not just about how we conceptualize diversity. We must also look at the built environment. The built environment is also a reflection of what diversity looks like. I already talked about the bathrooms. That's one example, right? Because there's a kind of pedagogical act and pedagogical value in the built environment. When I walk in and see a gender-neutral bathroom, that tells me I'm in a certain kind of place. It's like the sociological literature on metal detectors in school. When you walk into a school and you see metal detectors, it doesn't make students feel more safe, it makes them feel less safe. When you walk into a place where you need to be checked for guns, that don't make nobody feel safer. When Chris Rock say, I don't like going in clubs with guns, with metal detectors, because there's people outside with guns. And they know you ain't got one. There's a certain kind of pedagogy, a certain kind of lesson, a certain kind of teaching practice that's happening implicitly, tacitly, what we would say the hidden curriculum is of the institution. See, the articulated curriculum is easy. It's on the syllabus. It's in the mission statement. It's in the department statement. But the hidden curriculum is what happens when you see flags everywhere. It's what happens, and I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I mean, we could have a conversation about that, but I'm saying just the fact that it's there is a particular lesson. It's a part of the hidden curriculum. When you walk in the cafeteria and you don't see healthy food choices, but you see lots of ads for magazines, there's a kind of conditioning for consumerism that's happening in the institution. There's a particular relationship when you have prayer rooms but none that accommodate Muslim students. When you have parent-teacher night at a high school, or you have classes at the time where people are going to Jummah. There's a particular curriculum, hidden curriculum. It tells us what matters. We see it in the media all the time. We'll pray for France, but we won't say nothing about a bombing in Lebanon. We'll be outraged about a missing white woman. We still looking for John Benet Ramsey, 25 years later. But a whole village of Nigerian girls went missing, and we had to fight to get it on TV. A whole group of Mexican teenagers, college students actually, went missing, 23 of them, 2 years ago. We're still looking for them. White folk are missing, people of color are just gone. It sends a message about whose body matters, whose lives matter. Sidetracking note, that's why black folk got to scream all lives matter. Not because we neglect or negate the legitimacy of other people's lives, but because it is our lives that have been marginalized and erased. So when we say that our lives matter, we are not rejecting that your lives matter. We are simply saying, hey, our lives matter too. And the reason why we reject all lives matter as a rejoinder is not because we don't think all lives matter. It's because of the timing of the interjection. If when black folk were hanging from trees, you say, hey, put them down, all lives matter. When we were picking cotton, you say, hey, wait a minute, let me help. That all lives matter. When we were getting locked up and railroaded for crimes we didn't commit, if we said we got to stop this because all lives matter, when our leaders are assassinated and we say, no, don't kill them, all lives matter, then we might listen. But it's only when we speak up about our lives mattering that you say that all lives matter. That makes me question your intention, because there's a whole bunch of lives that didn't seem to matter when you banned them from the country 2 weeks ago. All lives matter would have came in handy right about then. Again, no extra charge for that, we on diversity, but it got me thinking about stuff. They start playing 50, I start breaking the rules. But the built environment matters. You see, the built environment, the classroom, the curriculum, the budgets, they all matter. They tell you whether the institution loves you or not. And I ain't talking about love in a mushy kind of way. I'm talking about, as Cornell and Dice know, I'm gonna say that, they said justice is what love looks like in public. Right? Justice is what love looks like in public. So I'm talking about whether the institution loves you. I'm talking about an ethic of justice, an ethic of inclusion, an ethic of care. Because if I walk into a campus as a first-generation Latina and I can't find no faculty in my department that look like me, that makes me question if you love me institutionally. If you come to my school in the hood and say, we love to recruit students, we want you here, we need you here, we got to have you here, we're proud to have you here, but you don't give me no money when I get here, that sends a message, how much do you really love me? If you can find me on the brochure and on the website, I seen all of y'all on the website, every single one of y'all. If I can see you on the website and the brochure, but when I walk through campus, the campus is still marked as white, not just by how it's demographically populated, but how it's culturally situated. What do I mean? When I walk in the cafeteria, what kind of food we got? We got Tabasco sauce, we got hot sauce. There's a difference. I'm just saying. Don't just have one thing, give me all that. When I walk into the STEM fields, if all the faculty are men, and all the men are white, and all the whites are straight, and all the straights are cis, then maybe that sends a message that I don't belong here. Do you love me? When I walk into the school store or the local beauty supply store, if all the hair care products don't fit my hair as it grows out of my head, do you love me? Do you want me here? Don't say you love me. Show you love me. Show it in public by how you treat me in public. If he ain't had no words for you on Tuesday on the 14th, if he went missing for a day, I was locked up, I had a seizure, popped back up on the 15th, maybe, just maybe, that person don't love you like they say they do. The commitment is in the publicity. We gotta demand more from our institutions. We gotta demand more from each other. Don't just give me Black studies and African American studies. Make it a mandatory commitment. I'm tired of walking into Black studies classrooms and all I see is Black people. Because I done took a whole lot of white studies classes. In fact, most of them I done took, including some of the Black studies classes, was really white studies classes, depending on how they was taught. But we all benefit from Black studies. We all benefit from queer studies. We all benefit from disability studies. Let's engage and force the university to engage. Unless the whole community comes to the table, what good is it? We got to do something different. What time is it? I'm sorry, it got me going over, running my mouth. I apologize. I know y'all got stuff. I know y'all got something to do. But the question, at some point, is not just what does the institution do, is what do y'all do? Because institution's going to institution. They're going to do what they do. And as we enter this neoliberal, maybe even proto-fascist moment, what we're recognizing is that the university, as always, doesn't have feelings. It has interests. More and more university professors are turning into, university presidents are becoming more like CEOs of multinational corporations. Even well-intentioned people, the structure itself demands a kind of technocratic rationality that almost overdetermines their job performance. In other words, they got demands, they got to raise money, they got to do this, they got to keep their job, and so they end up like CEOs more than the educational leaders that they may have wanted to be when they started the job. So from the top down, we have a technocratic impulse and demand, and then it trickles on down because like any other neoliberal sensibility, it's overdetermined by notions of deregulation and privatization and efficiency and austerity. What that mean? It mean that graduate students get overworked, teach too many classes, don't get enough funding, tenure gets pushed to the side, labor gets casualized, we have the adjunctification of the university, adjuncts don't get paid enough, students get fewer and fewer deliverables and pay more and more in tuition, the staff gets less and less of a living wage and fewer resources to pay, and the entire institution pays a price for its gentrification of neighboring areas. They become like settler colonialists rather than neighborhood partners. So against the backdrop of that, stop waiting for them to give you stuff. The time now is to take stuff. Of sort, yes, reparations. What does reparation mean? It means to repair the damage done. So how do we repair the damage done? We ask for investment. We ask for representation and inclusion. And then they say no. And then we demand those very things. How do you all do that in this moment? Well, first thing you got to do is organize. 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 I can't say that enough, students and faculty. Staff, we have to organize. We have to put together or partner with organizations that will demand that our interests be met. Now, any organization and let me highlight the fact that I said organize, but also that I'm saying join organizations. Don't just go around starting some, join some. Y'all ain't got enough of y'all to be starting all these daggone organizations. It'd be 50 black people in 25 organizations. Everybody president and vice president. I need you all to join organizations and connect across difference. We need intersectionality in our organizing. Y'all don't be telling me you worried about saving the black student if you're not worried about rape culture. Because there are no black students who aren't also gendered. And if you are gendered, then you are either vulnerable and susceptible to rape culture and sexual violence on campus, or as men, it is your ultimate, primary, and almost exclusive responsibility to stop it. Men, it is our responsibility to stop rape culture, not women. We got to do this work now. So that means that we have to be committed and interested in it. Don't tell me that you're only interested in race and gender and you're not thinking about sexual identity. Also, don't tell me that you're only interested in student organizing when you got a labor force in this university that doesn't have access to the same things you do as students or faculty. We got to organize with the janitorial staff. We got to organize with the grounds crew. We got to organize with the adjuncts. We got to organize with everybody who's marginalized. I ain't just talking about Rutgers. I'm saying around the globe, because Rutgers ain't perfect, but Rutgers ain't the worst space either. We got to find pockets everywhere where people are vulnerable and work with them. We must organize across difference. We must organize across issues. We must organize intersectionally, and y'all must organize even when you don't get to be in charge, even when you don't get the microphone, even when you lose a vote, even when you think you ain't got no reason to stay. Sometimes you got to stay to move the agenda forward. It ain't about you, it's about justice. So the question becomes, do you love us enough to hang around and stay? We got to organize. Make your organizations do what they're supposed to do. You on the campus NAACP, make this be a real NAACP. Not no neoliberal, happy to be in the room, smiling in Trump Tower NAACP. Be a 09 Ida B. Wells Barnett. Lynch stopping, freedom chasing NAACP. Campus Greeks, don't just be walking around strolling. You a member of Omega Psi Phi? Help organize a literacy program. Take the program, learn how to read yourself. And then teach some other people. We got alphas here? There you go. There you go. Organize. It's enough for y'all to organize. Our children need cultural experiences. They need to learn. They need access to things that they won't otherwise get. Take them to the skating rink. Nobody skates like alphas. Take them and teach them how to skate. What? I'm just saying. Let me stop for y'all. I had an iota joke, but like, for what, right? Like, oh, two of the founders are here. Yo, what's up? I never met two iotas in the same room before. Yo, that's what's up. That's what's up. That's what's up, man. That's dope. Was that 16, when y'all founded?
1963.
Wow. The whole line. So, where was I? Organize. Seriously though, we have to organize. And we have to resist. Because organizing without resistance is pointless. What does resistance look like, particularly in a university context? Remember, I said universities don't have feelings. They have interests. So your job as you resist is to force the university's interests to converge with yours. Make the university uncomfortable. So universities don't like to, cover your ears, sir. Universities don't like to be uncomfortable. They love to trumpet out their victories. They love to show you on the website, but they don't love disruption. Nobody loves disruption. So when y'all suddenly on Twitter, Black at Harvard, when y'all are in Mizzou, or Ole Miss, protesting, suddenly the conversation changes when the world is watching. It's kind of like, y'all grew up in the hood, the people from Newark know what I'm talking about. You got roaches. You got mice, right? When you turn the lights out, they do whatever they want to do. They sit on your crib, they open the refrigerator door, they DVR TV shows, they do whatever they want to do. But once you flick the light on, they scatter. Putting a spotlight on it is what you have to. Now, the spotlight is just the entry point, the march or the sit-in or the occupation of an office is just the starting point. That's the spotlight to the problem. That dramatizes the situation, but you got to be willing to do that. The situation in Mizzou didn't change because the university got religion and felt bad about white supremacy on campus. It's when the football team was willing to walk off the field and say, we're going to willing to lose our scholarships and compromise this $1 million a week, that the university said, wait a minute, we can have unhappy Negroes, but we can't lose $1 million a week. We got to do something. Y'all got to make them uncomfortable. Make them uncomfortable. When the university gives you a protest area, universities love to give people protest area. We love free speech. We give a whole area designated for it. The last place you should go is where they tell y'all to go. If they tell you to protest over here, y'all need to be over there. If they say protest outside, you need to be inside. If they say protest in the square, you go to their office and don't leave. If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it, shut it down. That's how you protest. You got to be willing to resist, but you got to be willing to pay a price. Everybody want to go to heaven, don't nobody want to die. Students always talk, I want to change the world, but I want to work at Goldman Sachs. I want to protest to shut this university down, but I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want my parents to find out. Now, I ain't telling you to get in trouble, and I ain't telling you not to take the job. That's up to you. But what I am telling you is there is a price to be paid to sacrifice. There's a price to be paid to struggle. There's a price to be paid to resist. And I ain't gonna lie to you, you're only gonna be here for 4 years. Some of y'all maybe 6. I'm not clowning, I'm saying college takes long. Some people do pharmacy, some people do other stuff, 5, 6 years, Qs, 10 years. I don't care how long it takes. My point is, you may not see the change that you want. Your struggle might be enjoyed by the next cohort of students. You might fight for a program that you don't get to participate in. You might get funding and scholarships from a neighborhood that you come from, but you don't get to enjoy the scholarship because you graduate first. But you got to think beyond yourself. You got to think of something big. I don't care if you're a senior. Keep struggling. Keep resisting. Keep producing something that is bigger than you. But you got to be willing to be unpopular. You got to be willing to make the sacrifice, because sometimes things going to happen and you're going to be alone. Some of y'all are organizing on campus right now, and you're like, man, I'm so alone. I'm reading, I'm struggling, and I'm organizing, and everybody telling me I think I know everything. People think, you read one book, you think you're smart. And nah, I'm just trying to build and grow. If you come to college for 4 years and you get a 4.0 and ain't changed your fundamental worldview at all, you done failed. You here to change. You're here to be unsettled. But you feel alone if you out here doing this work by yourself. You struggling on the racial front and the brothers is with you, but as soon as you talk about gender, the brothers scatter and turn into Hotep Harry. You might feel alone. You organize and 5,000 people come to the party, 500 come to the step show, and only 5 people come when it's time to do real work. You might feel alone. You work on campus, you a staff or faculty member, and you work with great liberal white folk, because academics tend to be great liberal white folk. They love black people till it's time to hire one. Then suddenly, nobody's quite qualified. Nobody fits our pool. Nobody's CV is exactly in line with our blah, 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 white, white, white. And at some point, you might feel alone. But alone is what you feel when you struggle for justice. It's going to be a small group of y'all doing the work. It's going to be a small group of y'all organizing. Stop feeling bad about it. Stop waiting for the majority. Stop waiting for consensus. Consensus ain't never been the starting point for struggle. Malcolm ain't have consensus. Bayard ain't have consensus? Fannie Lou ain't have consensus. Ella ain't have consensus. Angela ain't have consensus. Asada ain't have consensus. Harriet ain't have consensus. I can't even say it. That's how alone I feel. But you struggle anyway. You do the work anyway. And as the great philosopher said as we conclude in Black History Month, the homie said, Hov, it ain't many of us. Less is more, nigga. There's plenty of us. Thank you. God bless you. Free the land, free all political prisoners. Yo to the newts.
Good afternoon to you all. I've heard Dr. Lamont Hill on many TV programs, on his provocative, on CNN, on other programs, but it's so wonderful to hear him in person. What a thought-provoking and inspiring talk that was. Thank you. As many of you in the audience know, and you can probably sense from my accent, I grew up and was raised in South Africa. And one of South Africa's foremost leaders in higher education, who became Nelson Mandela's first chief of staff, Jakes Carvell, said that those working in higher education are privileged in the sense that they get paid to ask questions. It is therefore, Carvell went on to say, imperative that we ask important questions. And Dr. Lamont Hill, in this generation, I think, is one of the important prophetic voices who's asking among the most important questions, and it was a privilege for us to have him here at Rutgers today. I have a number of questions that I could ask Dr. Hill from his provocative writings, from his appearances on television, but I want you to give you the chance to come up, and I'm sure you have questions. Probably we'll take two at a time, one from this end, yes, one from the other end, and then you can...
That sounds perfect.
Please.
Hi.
No, I'm good, thank you.
My name is Michael Anderson. I'm a senior here, and I know you talk a lot about the prison industrial complex, and I know during the 80s and early 90s here, a lot of the students on campus did a lot of work helping Rutgers divest money from South Africa during apartheid, and I was just wondering if you could enlighten us as to how, in general, universities are connected to funding the prison industrial complex, and and the second question is, what does the world look like without our current state of prisons? Yeah.
Let's take one from this end and then prison question. Chris?
Hello, I'm Christopher Etienne. I'm a Rutgers alum. So I'm also a journalist, and look into the field, it's roughly, 5 or 6%, minorities that actually represent these major news networks. And so my question to you is, as somebody who's getting into the media, as somebody who's been part of the media, right, how do you speak about race, right, and be acknowledged as an intellectual rather than be dismissed as an overly sensitive radical?
Yeah. Well, first, I think you're being very generous. I think much of the TV viewing audience, judging from my tweets and my emails, does think of me as an overly sensitive radical. Also a product of affirmative action, and sometimes other things. Those are some of the nicer people. I'm always fascinated by those folk, too. One person, Leslie, told me I only got my Morehouse job because of affirmative action. So, there and then back to your question. I think there are a few things. I think it goes back to the thing I said in my talk, which was, one, we have to ask what our goals are. Who do we want to be in these spaces? Right? Because the question, to some extent, respectfully presumes that we should want to be in mainstream media. And I'm not convinced that we should. I think there is value to being there, that's why I'm there, right? But it's not the only game in town, and I think part of the challenge of mainstream media isn't just what we talk about and the way we talk about particular issues, how we talk about race. Don Lemon will say, hey, Marc, we want you to explain racism in America. You got 3 minutes, right? And that's not particular to Don or CNN. That's just the nature of television, right? It's everything's in these small consumable bites. Some of it is that there are certain taken for granted assumptions about the world that it's very difficult to dislodge on television, because then you do sound crazy, right? Because if you only have 30 seconds, for example, to explain, if I were to take your question for a minute, somebody says, well, how do we fix prison? I say, well, I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't believe there should be prison. There'll be, which is what I believe, right? But then they'll say, whoa, Marc, we got to go to commercial. And then tomorrow Breitbart says, Marc Lamont Hill says, free all the murderers, right?
Exactly.
And that becomes how TV functions. So I think sometimes mainstream broadcast journalism doesn't allow for the kind of nuance and complexity. I think what's interesting is now we have venues like HuffPost or Vice, more so now than HuffPost is kind of dead now, HuffPost Live. But these other spaces which allow for more nuanced and interesting conversation. They're longer form. They're not. Oftentimes, digital ads allow you to, while they bombard you, they also allow you to have uninterrupted conversation. So while I might have an ad for Target blinking at the bottom, we can actually have a 30-minute conversation during which we can actually unpack some of these nuances. As an individual in the newsroom, and I've been in the newsroom both print and broadcast, it's frustrating because there are often one or two people. And part of the challenge is behind the camera, behind the desk, right? We always want to see more black people on TV. We freak out because Tamron Hall gets replaced by Megyn Kelly, which I think is troublesome. But we also have to ask, how is that position to happen where a high-ranking, high-rated show, an hour of today's show gets pushed back? It's because who's the exec? So we have to think about who's on the other side of the camera, who the producers are, who the segment producers are, who the bookers are. A TV segment in particular is shaped not just by the topic, because they kind of tell you what you're going to talk about. It's shaped by the guests. And the guests are shaped by who they book. And bookers tend to book who they always book. If a black person gets shot, I guarantee you, if I feel my phone vibrating like 10 times while I'm during the day, I'm like, somebody got shot. And CNN is calling me to talk about it, right? Me and Harry Houck, right? So part of it is that's just their go-to, but they won't call me for Middle East politics necessarily, even though that's an area of expertise that I have, right? So it's a very interesting dynamic. So part of what it is to not just think about what topics we choose, but who gets booked and who does the choosing, and also which topics get chosen. So again, as I mentioned before, it's interesting to say, okay, we could talk about the Ferguson shooting differently, or we could talk about racism or xenophobia differently, but we could also talk about different news. There's an amazing array of things happening right now around the world, and we could look to China, we could look to Saudi Arabia, we could look to Brazil, and find really interesting news stories today, but we're not going to do that. We'll talk about Russia to the extent that it links us to Donald Trump. We'll talk about Syria to the extent that it links us to Donald Trump. I mean, in some sense, everything is driven by how much money we can make, and that's, I think, one of the challenges and shortcomings of 24-hour cable media is that there's always has to be something breaking. You watch CNN, there's always a breaking story. Breaking, nothing's happened, And there's a rush in all of news to not be most accurate, but to be first. And when there's a race to be first rather than a race to be right, it leads to a very different outcome. And that I also find to be somewhat troublesome. I think what's great is that now digital media and smartphone technology, which has saturated the market, et cetera, has allowed everyday citizens to play a bigger role in media making and in production and in the counter-narration of dominant stories, so that when we're on the ground in Ferguson getting tear gas and Fox News and MSNBC are saying, no, it's just smoke, and we're literally trying to find ways to breathe, we got kids on the ground with smartphones tweeting it. Philando Castile can Facebook Live, or his girlfriend can Facebook Live him being shot by police. There are ways that we can challenge and counter-narrate the struggle. We can get support from Gazan children on how to make makeshift gas masks or how to clean our eyes out when we're getting tear gas on the ground from state-sponsored violence. So it's a very different moment and a very different sense of globality, a very different sense of community, a very different sense of publicity. We got all this technology. So as a journalist, I'm actually inspired by this moment. I'm inspired by all the technology, and I'm inspired by the opportunities I have to make media without having to wait for CNN or MSNBC or ABC or CBS or somebody to call. We can make our own stuff. And I think the more that we do that, the more of a resistance movement we can have. And I don't expect them to ever stop calling me crazy or radical, because I am a radical. You know what I mean? And I'm very proud of that title. I don't run from it, you know? I'm more interested in figuring out how a radical politics can become normalized, which takes me to your question. So I think, first of all, I think divestment, I support divestment in general of unhealthy or rather unjust institutions. Boycott, divest, I mean, for example, we're going through this right now with Israel, right? I support the BDS movement. I am an active member of the BDS movement because I believe that boycotting, divestment, and sanctions are one of the most civil and peaceful methods of resistance. It's not the only method, but it is I think, an ideal method of resisting the occupation of Palestine. And one of the things we look back to is the apartheid movement. And we look to the fact that the universities, again, were heavily resistant to divest in the 90s and in the 80s. And we had to protest, we had to march, we had to fight because they normalized the regime. And some of the same arguments, and I'm backing up to prison, I'm just trying to make the connection because I think it cuts across a few questions. One of the arguments people make when we say BDS movement is, oh my God, but what about all the interesting stuff happening in Israeli universities? The same argument was made in South Africa, right? That if you boycott South African universities, what about intellectual exchange? What about all these great new ideas that are being produced, right? And so there's a way that we try to normalize oppression and deodorize oppression. So what I think these divestment, boycotting, and sanctions across the board do is they put a spotlight on the problem, they offer concrete solutions, and they offer a method of redress for everyday people, right, as well as institutions. So that's why I support them. And so when I get to the university with regard to mass incarceration, I sometimes resist the term mass incarceration because it can suggest that somehow that a mass incarceration in America would suggest that all American citizens are being incarcerated or susceptible to being incarcerated at the same rate. And it's not. It's really mass incarceration of black people and brown people. And you know what I mean? So I don't want to frame it as this kind of problem where all citizens are all susceptible to the prison regime, because they're not. But I understand your question, and I take it in good faith. There is an investment in mass incarceration because there's an investment. There's multiple levels of mass incarceration investment because of this thing you call the prison industrial complex. And the prison industrial complex refers to the way that prisons themselves produce an industry. It's not just privatization of prison, which is one piece of it. Not as much as people think, particularly on the federal level. But it's also about the businesses that hover around the prison. So for example, when I go into when I wrote a book with Mumia Abu-Jamal in 2011, and for the 2 years prior, I would fly to Pittsburgh, then drive an hour to the prison. And the prison was in Waynesburg, PA, and when you walk into Waynesburg, PA, you see nothing but white folk. But when you walk into the prison, you see nothing but black folk. The town Waynesburg probably got, I think, 10, 12,000 people in it. It's not a big town, smaller than Ferguson, Missouri. Might be 20,000, probably about the size of Ferguson, a little smaller. It's like 85% white, 90% white. The prison is like the opposite demographic. The prisoners don't come from Waynesburg. They come from Philly, and they come from Pittsburgh. And they come from the hood of both, right? So when I walk into Waynesburg town, and I'm sitting there waiting for a guard shift, and anybody who goes to prison, you know that guard shift can take an hour just waiting for guards to move around. All the prison guards are from Waynesburg, almost. And those that aren't are from the town right next door to Waynesburg. Like Waynesburg to them is like the big city. And I've talked to them and I'm observing their conversations. They're like, yeah, we all kind of know each other. We from the same town, went to the same high schools, played football together, yada, yada, yada. And we all kind of took jobs there. This is kind of like the town job. And people who don't take jobs there, they may work at the gas station. And whose gas are they filling up? The many families that are caravanning back and forth to come in. Some guy is an electrician. Whose lights is he fixing? Whose electricity is he wiring? He's working in the prison. Some people have catering services that deliver to the prison. They're outsourcing jobs to plumbers. Essentially, the town economy hovers around the existence of a prison. That's a prison industrial complex. The privatization of pay lawyers, the contract lawyers being used instead of public defenders at times. This becomes part of the prison industrial complex. The fact that there is more representation, because now even though there's maybe 20,000 people in the town, this is why I got the number mixed up, there might be 8,000 people in the prison and 12,000 people in the town. But because the prisoners now count as residents of Waynesburg, the town population goes from 12,000 to 20,000. And because they got 20,000 people now, they get more money. They get more roads. They get better schools. They may even get more representation in their state houses. So because now they get better political representation because they got prisoners. They get more money because they have prisoners. So if you are the legislator who has a bill across his desk to decarcerate, that's your job. You the plumber, that's your job. So people have a material investment in the prison itself. So part of what we want to do when we talk about BDS at the level of the prison, I ain't talking about Israel right now, I'm talking about the prison, is to take the profit out of mass incarceration. So that means that if universities have investments in the companies that invest in prison, or if they have investments in the companies that are privatizing prison, and we just saw a federal bill come across for federal prison, but that doesn't affect state prison, which accounts for, well, I think either 65 or 85, I can't remember the number, just don't quote me on it, but it's in the book, my book, that accounts for the number of state prisons where you see the bulk of privatization. So if we can take the money out of privatization, if we can take the money out of this obsession with locking people up, then maybe we can do something different, and that becomes the responsibility of students. That becomes the responsibility of faculty. That becomes the responsibility of administrators. Now, the question is, you asked me, the last one was the most provocative one, which is, well, what does a world look like without prison? That means we have to decarcerate our imagination. It is easier for people to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine a world without prison. What does it mean to decarcerate our imagination? It means that we have to move from a retributive model to a restorative model of justice. The retributive model says, who did it and how do we punish them? The restorative model says, who was hurt and how do we make them whole again? It's a whole different approach to the world. We're still trying to solve a problem, but our end goal is making people whole rather than making people pay. It means that we don't, as Lois Vacan talks about, we move from a medicalized and socialized state to a penalized state. That means that when someone is on drugs, we treat it as a medical problem, not as a social problem. When someone has a mental illness and we shut down the mental institutions in the 70s and 80s, and then they're on the street, and then we make it illegal to be on the street, and then we lock them up for being on the street, we have effectively criminalized mental illness. So what we have to do is invest medically and socially in people. We have to use a language of investment and love rather than containment and blame. And when we do that, we shift the world. But there's a practical question, which is, how do you have a world without prisons? Well, the first thing you need is decarceration. We need to find ways to get people out of prison. How do you do that? You get rid of the bail system, for example. 80% of people in state prisons strike that number. 80% of people in jails around the country are there because they can't afford bail money. Sandra Bland probably would be alive if she were a man. Sandra Bland would probably be alive if she were white. But Sandra Bland would definitely be alive if she had $500. Because she was in jail because she didn't have bail money. She wouldn't have been there for the weekend if she had $500. Khalif Browder would be alive if he'd had $300 bail, $3,000 bond. Bail is not a punishment. Bail is to ensure that you return to court. And if bail becomes prohibitive, if you can't afford to pay the bail, and so you're stuck in jail, that means we have a debtor's prison. That is evil. 80% of a jail system being filled by people who are only there because they can't afford not to be is evil. That's decarceration. Decarceration is suspended sentences. It's community-based dispute resolution. It's work release. It's finding ways to make people whole and integrate people back into society rather than putting them in a cage. Excarceration. Excarceration is no longer using the prison as the resolution for all our social contradictions. We can, for example, decriminalize things like weed. Come on, y'all. We could decriminalize gambling. We could decriminalize prostitution. We could decriminalize things that often are informed by a kind of Victorian prudishness and moral skittishness rather than an actual investment in people. That doesn't mean that I want people to make unhealthy choices, but criminalizing unhealthy choices doesn't do anything. And oftentimes the prohibition and all the prohibitive acts surrounding that bad choice or unhealthy choice make it more dangerous than it otherwise would be. So we have to think about it in that way. And then some of y'all are like, this all sound good, but I got this dude in my neighborhood. That mom crazy. This all sound good, but he likes to kill people. And the serious question becomes, what do you do with the murderer? What do you do with the serial killer? What do you do with the rapist? What do you do with the child molester? Those are reasonable questions. My answer to you would be, I am unconvinced that there is anybody who is a serial killer or a child molester or a rapist who does not have mental health issues. And so for me, the answer is not to put them in a cage for 20 years and they still come out a rapist. They still come out a child molester. Rather, it is to put them in secured medical confinement so that they can get medical treatment for this. Now, you might say, well, if you're in secured medical confinement, how's that different than the prison? It is different in structure. It is different in goal. It is different in intent. It is different in treatment. It is different in environment. The man who shot Ronald Reagan is home because he spent decades with medical treatment, and they invested in him, and they treated him, and they gave him an ethic of care, and now he's able to come back home. Whole. It took a long time, but he was able to do it. I don't know if that happens if he's sitting in Rikers Island for 30 years. It's a different position, it's a different investment, but we have to be courageous enough to imagine the world without prison. Yes. I know I gave 2 long answers. I'm gonna give shorter. I'm gonna take these last 3 and I'm gonna answer them shortly. 4? Yes, sir. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, brother.
First off, I want to thank you for coming here. You are a public intellectual that I admire. And
Thank you so much, man.
I aspire to be pretty much everything you are today. And I mean that undoubtedly.
It means a great deal to me, brother.
So my question to you, sir, is a reference from your book. And I see how it ties to how you mentioned.
I wrote that like a year ago, so I might forgot.
Right. There's a quote you mentioned today that just stuck out to me. You said, diversify our diversity. And I think that aligns with something you said in your book.
Good.
Quote. You reference how community policing should be perceived. You say, for it is the beat cop who projects the feeling that law enforcement is community work, not same, distant, faceless power forcing conformity into ordinary life.
Yeah.
Proper policing, they argued, should be shaped by standards of neighborhood rather than the rules of the state.
Right.
So my question, tying back to institutionalized, platforms like universities, how do we, as student organizations, go about, implementing change in a way that is not deemed as, conforming or, submitting? Because, we hear about this narrative that, if you talk politely to a police officer, you're being what do you call it, complacent, or you're conforming to the power.
Right.
So how do you go about resisting in means of still doing so without putting your life at risk?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think resistance looks a lot of different ways. We have a whole civil rights tradition of the 1960s that emerges around a particular commitment to decency, a particular commitment to respectability. And I don't mean respectability in the way, the notion of respectability has somewhat been misunderstood. And I think Evelyn Brooks, I encourage people to actually read her work, Righteous Discontent, as opposed to just kind of using that phrase. Because I think sometimes the notion of respectability has become pejorative, purely pejorative. I think there are critiques, but it becomes purely pejorative. I think there are ways that how one presents the self is not merely a kind of piece of cultural politics, right? We want to look a certain way so that we can resist in a certain way, or we want to convince the majority that we are worth respecting. It's also a survival tactic. And I think it's a valuable one. I don't think you have to spit in the face of an officer. Let me be clear, don't spit in the face of an officer. But what I'm saying is I don't think you have to scream back all the time. I think there are ways to be strategic. There are ways to get the job done without compromising your safety. And I don't think you should ever compromise your safety just to do it. So I think the performance of self can look different in different contexts. Some contexts I do think call for other forms of resistance that aren't so respectable. I don't believe in nonviolence, for example, as a philosophy. I believe in it as a tactic, a strategy. But I wouldn't tell an occupied people, for example, that they should just be peaceful. I wouldn't tell people who are being shot at not to shoot back. I just can't. That's just not. That's not in my constitution, my moral constitution. So I think there's a variety of strategies that we can use. I think to link that to your other question, the other piece of the question around diversity and around inclusion, I'm not sure. Again, I don't want to sell you a dream that you can have this nice, smooth, warm, and fuzzy interaction all the time and still get the change you want. Revolutions are not peaceful. Revolutions are not neat. Revolutions are messy, and they do come at a price. And we have to either be willing to pay it, or if we're scared, say we're scared, and not. I think the point I was making about community policing, and let me be clear, I don't believe in community policing, I believe in communities without police. That is my telos, that is my end goal. But to the extent that we have police in our community, I think one thing we can do is have police that look like us. We can have police that are from the neighborhood, and we can have police that actually patrol a beat. I mean, one of the flaws of broken windows theory is that it was predicated on a beat cop, someone walking around. But if you're in a patrol car riding through, It's a very different interaction with neighborhoods. You don't know the people. You don't know what's going on, and so everything becomes a broken window. And people start to look like broken windows, and when you think you're policing disorder, which is what the exogenous variable is in the equation, you're actually policing often poverty and blackness. And so if you want a different relationship with police, you probably need different police, and you need a different kind of structure around how police come up, but also who gets to make the rules. Broken windows policing was predicated on the neighborhood having kind of internal emic understanding of what a rule was and what a good or broken rule was and how we could adjust it. So yeah, you could drink on the corner, just put a brown bag. We're not locking you up for that. Yeah, you can sit on the corner, but you can't sleep on the corner, right? Little things, and if you grew up in the hood, you know that, right? If you out there with a bottle, you got to cover it up. It's illegal to drink outside, but the police ain't really trying to lock you up for a bottle as long as you put a bag on it. That becomes the kind of agreement between police and law enforcement, so police feel respected and neighborhoods get to drink their 40. And that's a perfectly fine way. But what happens when you don't have that kind of neighborhood internal understanding and commitment to collaboration is you end up with people getting locked up for having 40s while real crimes are happening. Yes, sir.
Michael Cummins III, a Q that can't read.
Yes, I appreciate that. Unicorn, go ahead.
All right, so I'm a transfer student. I went to Delaware State University. That's a historically black college and university for those who don't know. And I've experienced the culture at a HBCU and a PWI, and you spoke a lot about diversity, so I want to know if you think HBCUs are progressive or regressive towards diversity.
It's a complicated question because all HBCUs aren't the same. We got 112 now, 113 historically black colleges and universities, and oftentimes when we think about HBCUs, we think about Howard and Spelman and Morehouse. When most aren't Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse, most are Del State and Cheney and Langston and Xavier and Dillard, et cetera. And so I say that to say that many are wrestling with different challenges, economically, structurally, et cetera. If we're talking about diversity at the level of race, do I think HBCUs need more white people? If we're talking about the black-white paradigm, no, I don't think HBCUs need more white people. I think it's fine to have them. I don't think they need more, because I think they have a particular historic mission. I think HBCUs need to be more open and honest about LGBT politics and populations. I think it's shameful. The Morehouse dress code was something I found shameful when it came out. I mean, it was clearly an attack on queer students. You know, I think that we need to think about religious diversity. We need to think about so many things. I'll be honest with you, I have found more progressive politics in PWIs in general than I have in HBCUs. That's been my experience, attending Morehouse and as a professor at Morehouse, is that I find some of the most conservative policies come out of places like Morehouse and Hampton or Spelman or whatever. Spelman's actually quite progressive, but that's kind of the exception. But other than that, I think we see very troublesome politics coming out of those places. So I think we need an action plan for diversity at HBCUs, but we need other things too. We need money. We need funding. We need Parent Plus loans to be enhanced. We don't need another 8 years of a tax on HBCUs, at least the first 4 or 5 years. I mean, we need a serious Marshall Plan for the black community, and I think HBCUs are a central part of it. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, sorry, my name is Sara Ibrahim. I'm a vice president of Palestine Children's Relief Fund, and I was just wondering.
Oh yeah, we're doing a thing, right?
Yes. So
cool.
That's not my question, but
no, but it just triggered me. Like yes.
So in the past, about 2 years ago, we had Dr. Cornel West come speak about the intersectionality between the struggle of Palestinians and Black struggle during the start, or of what was the start at the time of the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement.
That was major.
So what my question is, now our focus is, well, according to what's going on most recently, is the Syrian refugee crisis, which has been going on for many years, but now in particular with the ban on Syrians and refugees in general. I was wondering, how do you suggest that we mobilize a bigger movement? Because at the time when we organized our first event, we did actually have a lot of different, like a diverse crowd of people, whereas usually we have a lot of Arabs or a lot of Muslims. We had a bigger audience, and particularly because Dr. Cornel West brought most people together. But I do want to find a way to mobilize for this movement, since it is very important at the time, and I would love for people to come out to our event. So what do you suggest?
All right. Well, first thing is just y'all come. Right. It's an important movement. It's an important organization, and it's an important subject. I think what was interesting about the 2014, because I was part of the organizing around Ferguson and Palestine. I made that Dream Defender trip with Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter, Hands Up United, BYP 100, and a few other. We went to Jerusalem, Bethlehem,
Yeah, we've been
Nazareth.
following your, all your traveling to Palestine and everything.
Yeah. I mean, now I'm there all the time. I don't even tweet when I'm there sometime now, because it's like, I'm there just about every month or every other month,
Yeah.
and doing a project in East Jerusalem. And but one of the things that I found interesting in that first trip, there was so much energy around Palestine. Part of it's because of Ahmed Abu Ned and him being a Dream Defender. But I think part of the challenge, or part of that moment, was that there was just a lot of energy. And I think that the movements in 2014 that were emerging, particularly BLM and Dream Defenders, that were really taking some strong leadership positions, were decidedly intersectional across, and not just in their politics, but in their leadership. Mm-hmm. And I think we saw a value in also globalizing that. And because so many of us were committed to radical politics, we weren't just looking to a king, we were also looking to a Malcolm. And because Malcolm had talked about the black political imaginary, because Malcolm had talked about the need to support Arafat, because we had seen such a strong commitment from the Black Panthers, we'd seen James Baldwin writing really passionately about the 6-Day War and about 48. But I think after the 6-Day War, he really began to think through that essay he wrote in '83, another one he wrote in '81, were really important to thinking through these issues. And so because we were out of that intellectual tradition, I think it was easier for us to see the connection. Another connection we saw, quite honestly, was that there are black Palestinians or Afro-Palestinians. And when you go to Jericho or you go to East Jerusalem, if you go to the African Quarter, for example, I mean, there's nothing but, I won't say nothing but there are entire village sections of Afro-Palestinians. And so we could see ourselves in the tradition. Also, as folk who are wrestling with issues of state violence, I think there were very direct connections, more so than even with Syria, right? So when we go to Dheisheh and we see these girls rapping and talking about resistance to state violence, or we go to Hebron or Khalil and we see, just the awful atrocities that came when settlers really came in, for example, the Ibrahimi Mosque. And so we're like, oh, wait a minute, we've seen this kind of thing before, and people were making connections between sort of urban gentrification and settler colonialism. Connections I think are somewhat overstated, but because I think it's a very different project. But people were making their own connections, right? When we went to places like Adala, which is like a human rights organization, they were talking about, Palestinian children, both citizens of the Israeli state and those from the territories, who were like being framed by police after they were being killed by police, and then police were planting weapons in their hands.
Or incarcerated.
We took mass incarceration and the differential sentencing between Palestinian citizens and Israeli citizens. One goes to a military court, one goes to a judge, one has to be seen in 2 days, one has to be seen in 5 days. I mean, these types of differences we could relate to, right, as our own kind of apartheid, our own kind of Jim Crow. And so we saw connections and we saw solidarity, and we also saw reciprocity, right? There were Palestinians who were writing back to us, and again, the guys and children who were telling us how to clean out our eyes, or the people in the West Bank who were telling us how to respond to military occupation. I spend a lot of time in the old city in Jerusalem, and some days I'll sit there and just watch stop and frisk all day on Via Dolorosa. I'll just sit there and watch Palestinian children just be stopped and searched for no reason other than they're Palestinian and they're outside, right? They're literally being criminalized for being outside. And so we make those connections. I think that's significant. I'm getting somewhere. I'm sorry this is taking so long, but this is important, I think. I think with Syria, we haven't had the same kind of political connection, cultural connection, intellectual connection. Yeah. I think maybe our part of the moral shortcoming, though, is that we shouldn't need to see black people there to know that occupation is bad. We shouldn't need to see black people there to know that state violence is bad, to know that ethnic cleansing is bad. We should be able to resist it because it's wrong. So we should be outraged just on general principle, and I don't care whether it is in Kashmir, I don't care if it's in Sudan, I don't care if it's in Syria, I don't care where it is, we should be willing to speak back and resist. And I think that comes with political education on two levels. One, we have to be able to see the interconnectedness of all of us. We have to see a kind of resistance struggle, not just to a particular military regime or particular political regime, but to white supremacy, to colonialism, to honestly, and a resistance to kind of late capitalism. If we understand those structures, then we understand how all of it connects. We understand the relationship between being occupied in Palestine and being gentrified in Brooklyn. But I also don't want us to always have to find ourselves in that space, because there's a huge difference between being stateless, as you are if you're in two of the three territories in Palestine, than being in Brooklyn and Fort Greene, where I live. Like I'm not the same as, even if I'm gentrified in Brooklyn, that's not the same as, you know what I'm saying, as being in East Jerusalem. Well, that's probably a bad example, but you get my point. So there's very different things going on. I don't want us to overstate the relationship between the two. I think to get to the last part of your question, I think with Syria, we have to frame it as a human rights violation. We have to, a human rights crisis. We have to frame it as another form of ethnic cleansing, but we also have to have a kind of political end goal in mind. What do we want to happen? I think part of the problem was, particularly with black folk, is that we were so invested in Obama's administration and kind of uncritically celebrating his practice, that when Obama said we're going to draw yellow red lines, red line, red line, red line, we're like, okay, well, he said it. Then he said preemptive strike, and we were supporting it, right? We essentially began to adopt an even stronger Bush doctrine in Syria, at least rhetorically, than Bush had for Syria. Obama had a terrible set of policies on Syria, to the extent that he had any policy on Syria. And we didn't have a critique of it. And I think part of that, again, comes back to political education. Most folk can't tell you what the problem is in Syria, what the dynamics. You can run for president, I know what Aleppo is, right? So all of this, I think, is part of the mix, and all of this is part of what we have to wrestle with and think through. As far as getting people out, sadly, sometimes you just gotta have people know come in and make those connections. That's why Angela Davis was so important for Palestine. That's why Cornel West was so important for Palestine. That's why Danny Glover was so important. You know, so we need to bring those issues too. But again, we need a game plan and an end goal. But I got to say something else in complete candor. It also needs to be reciprocal, because when I'm on the line of Black Lives Matter, I often don't see enough Palestinians. When I'm out here, when we're out here fighting state violence, I don't see Syrians, quite frankly. And I'm not saying I don't see any, but what I'm saying is we need the reciprocity.
There's not enough solidarity.
There's not enough solidarity,
Yeah.
Exactly. And if there is solidarity, it's rhetorical. So we stand in solidarity, but we won't stand outside. You know what I'm saying? That's what I mean by reciprocity, right?
Trust in faith, but not in action.
Exactly. And so we need to show that. But people need to show up for Syria, because Syria just deserves to be shown up for. Particularly at a moment right now where not only are we continuing to, I mean, because if you, I mean, this is a longer conversation, but I mean, if you look at how proxy wars get funded, because the issue isn't just Assad, right? It's also Jabhat al-Nusra. It's also, there are all these forces that are being funded through wars and proxy wars that are coming through other countries that we often have a financial role in. Particularly, well, all right, so I don't want to go too long. I just don't get asked too many questions like this. So I only get asked black people stuff. So part of what we have to do is understand our complicity in this, right? The same way we do with the Israel question, right? Is we pay tax money, we help fund an occupation. What's our financial kind of complicity in the Syrian crisis? And then we need to frame it in that way so people understand that they're responsible for this to some extent. And then we need an end goal. And I think what's unwieldy is that is sometimes the solutions. Like, for example, we know, at least we had an idea of what apartheid should, or post-apartheid should look like. We had an idea, even on the BDS question, even if you're a Zionist, right, and someone else is a member of the PLO and they're debating the outcome, there's still very clear stakes attached. I'm not sure that we have a very clear narrative about what the end in Syria looks like. Is it crushing Assad and creating another vacuum like we saw in Iraq? Is it strikes? Is it an air zone? Is it emboldening Iran? I mean, there are all these things that we have to think through, and I think we need a richer conversation about that. But at the core, all that said, y'all, come to this event. Not just because I'm going to be there, not just because she's going to be there, but because this is an event that matters. We need solidarity between blacks and Arabs. All folk of color need solidarity. White folk, we need y'all there. We need justice. And Syria deserves justice. And the event is on
March 23rd.
March 23rd, yup. I knew that. Yep.
It's actually in this room.
And it's in this room. So there. All right.
Okay, thank you for that.
They've been standing a long time. Let me just do this. I have 1 minute left.
Okay, so take the two questions.
The questions, I promise I'll answer in 1 minute, but you can't intro yourself. You just got to ask the question.
Make your announcement. You have an announcement.
I just have an announcement because Just speaking to what you were saying earlier about demanding from our institutions to
Yep.
have a diversity requirement, there's a group on campus called the Cultural Coalition Competence. We're meeting tonight at 8 p.m. in the PRCC. Please come out. If you can't come out, tell your friend we need to get a diversity requirement in our core curriculum.
Yes.
Okay? The Paul Robeson Cultural Center, I'm sorry. Tonight
Right,
at
so
8
show
p.m.
up. It's pointless if we do all this clapping and being happy and then we don't organize with nobody. We support that sister and make sure you get that, because I know y'all didn't hear what she said because she said it so fast. Make sure you're going to stand, you're going to be right here, and we about to leave. Say that one more time.
The Cultural Competence Coalition is meeting tonight in the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at 8 p.m.
Boom. There we go. Last question.
Yes, sir. My question is about the black family. It's in crisis. We have far too many children that are not being raised in a healthy and constructive circumstance. We are the least married group in the country. And so from the perspective of, the question was asked about incarceration, the question about policing, we didn't really get a chance to talk about employment or economics, but I do think that the crisis that's impacting the black family, I would be curious to get your perspective. And so I have the pleasure of being one of the adjuncts with Dr. Ron Salmi.
I appreciate the question. I think I'm always wary of the black family question because I'm not saying in your case, but it often smuggles in very particular, often patriarchal and heterosexist ideas of what family should be, right? Women ain't getting married enough, or babies are born out of wedlock, and we start to employ all this language that can be troublesome. I think to some extent, I'm glad you mentioned prison and policing and all those, and employment, because I think those things are the biggest threats to black prosperity and black lives, as opposed to whether people get married or not. When we look at the data, if you are, middle class, not middle class, people may not be married. They may not have both custodial parents two custodial parents, but the children turn out just fine, right? So in many ways, that marriage thing is a proxy for a certain kind of economic stability that I think people need. How do you get economic stability? Access to living wages, access to proper resources, and also not locking up half the family, right? So, and then when you lock them up, you charge so much for telephone rates. You put the prison 200 miles from the family so that people are disconnected and they lose their connection. All those things matter. For me, that's much more interesting because I think what happens too often is if we talk about marriage as the kind of actual thing, then we almost enter a kind of patriarchal space of saying women need to marry themselves out of poverty, right? As opposed to suggesting that we can produce healthy relationships that may be same gender loving, that may be family and a family-oriented community built. A lot of us had one mom in the house. We had mamas in the house 50 years ago, but we had grandmama up the street. We had the neighbors. We had all these other things. I don't want to romanticize to be nostalgic about the past. What I'm saying is there are multiple ways of raising families. I think the key is for us to invest in communities, invest in people, and then some of those other things will work themselves out. But that's a great question. Thank you so much, brother. Thank you all. God bless you. Peace.